Hello and welcome to this NatSen ESS City University seminar series. I'm delighted to be chairing this seminar today, talking about the work that we've done as part of the Survey Futures project, thinking about the post-COVID-19 pandemic role of survey interviewers. I'm pleased to introduce two colleagues who've worked on this project, who will give the presentation today, which will be around 40 minutes or so. And then we will open up for questions. If you have any questions, then please do post them in the Q&A option. The chat option isn't available. So if you post your questions in the Q&A, that would be really helpful. So let me introduce to you my colleague, Sierra Mesplie-Cowan, who is a senior researcher, methodologist at NatSen Social Research, works in the Methodology and Innovation Hub. And also to Chris Charman, who is a human resources and reward expert at Merville's, who supports organisations in the development of strategies and policies for the effective management of their people. Chris has over 25 years experience in this area, and I'm really pleased that Chris led on a lot of the work that's being presented today. So without further ado, let me hand over to Sierra and to Chris. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Debbie. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about Survey Futures and what to expect today. So Survey Futures is an ESRC initiative that involves an extensive research program, training and capacity building initiatives, and some dissemination activities over a three-year period with funding of 3.3 million. This project is unique in that it involves academics, government researchers and analysts, as well as survey practitioners. This project aims to deliver a step change in survey research to ensure that it remains possible to carry out high-quality social surveys within the United Kingdom. There are some specific objectives of this project, and that is to ensure quality implications of survey design choices, and particularly in relation to survey inclusion and representativeness, as well as providing an understanding of skills and capacity needs of the sector, including who we're here to discuss today, the survey interviewer. Outputs of this project are to include research good practice guidance for survey design and implementation, as well as for survey commissioners and data users. Also, to identify ways to develop skills and capacity. This includes what we're focused on today, the updating of face-to-face survey role specifications to reflect the changing nature of their work. So, Chris, please may you move on to the next slide. Great. So this seminar is part dissemination of research findings of this project, but also engagement. At the end of the session, we would like to hear from you on what should come next. What should be our research questions? Who should we involve as participants, as well as reflections on what you've heard today? Within the presentation, Chris will suggest a collective response. We would like to hear your thoughts on this, what this should look like, any ideas of its use and impact on our industry. Chris, may you move on? Right, so let's move on to the focus of today, the research. Firstly, thank you to any of our research participants who may be on the call today. Recruitment of our participants was purposive. We looked first to the organisations who are already involved in the Survey Futures project, and then we searched for organisations who had a face-to-face field force and prioritised those that had social research, conducted social research. I looked at the company partners register at the MRC, as well as the members dictionary of the interviewer quality control scheme to find appropriate participants. And then it was also important to us to involve to have representation from all UK nations, and that included those from Wales and Northern Ireland. So without further ado, I'd like to pass on to Chris, who will be taking you through the findings of today.
Great, thank you very much, Sierra, and thank you to all of you for having me here today. I'm not a methodologist, as Debbie said. I'm a HR and reward expert, so do be kind. So where we want to turn to first is just as part of the survey research, we've originally looked at what was the role of the field interviewer before COVID-19. And some of that characteristics of the role. It's important to recognise that these changes didn't operate in a vacuum. Prior to the pandemic, mixed mode methodologies were growing, where the survey type did not demand in-person interaction, where that in-person interaction was really essential. So visitor tourist experience surveys or product hall test exit interviews, etc. The face-to-face fieldwork had been relatively unchanged for some time. All of the respondents really reported that they'd seen a growing increase in survey complexity affecting the role, as well as a greater use of technology. Prior to COVID, that field interviewer role did tend to be solely focused on field face-to-face interviewing, and separate teams really existed for other methods like telephone. The profile really of the workers was seen to be pretty consistent. It had often been older and often more female. Often a pre-retirement or retirement cohort. And they were characterized often by kind of long-standing and quite experienced interviewers. So that really formed a core. And outside of that, the turnover has always been traditionally quite high. The employment model, very much a casual worker basis. There hadn't been any guarantee of hours required by the worker or to the worker. Although there was some requirement for some employers to make sure that they were available to be able to complete work 2 to 3 days a week. There were two different kind of remuneration or pay models. A day rate, so effectively paid compensation for time spent. There would be premium for bank holiday or weekend working, or as a piece worker, effectively a paid performance model, where field interviewers were paid a unit rate for completed interviews. That unit rate was generally based on estimates of time required for interview travel. There were some variations around this performance model, some where they linked the rate for a shift based on past performance relative to set targets, so much more kind of truer sense of paid performance. One varied the amount paid based on different sorts of responses, not just completed surveys, and one undertook an annual hours approach. This chart shows relative pay of survey field interviewers over the past 10 years. I thought this was important context. What we're seeing here is that I've rebased to 2013 the minimum, or so-called now called living wage, as the legal UK minimum for workers relative to median earnings, which is all adults in the United Kingdom. So pay for the field interviewer tends towards the national living wage, that's the UK legal minimum, which reflects those low barriers to entry for work. So prior and through the pandemic, costs for employers and pay for field workers have been increasing much more rapidly for this cohort, the blue line that you can see there, because of the growth of this minimum wage. It's almost twice as high. And don't forget the other impact here is what we call compression. So when the wages of the individual workers is rising, those who are supervising them gets compressed. The gap narrows, and it tends to have a knock-on effect in terms of rising wages. So you'll see the pandemic line 2019, I think we can probably observe a quickening of that rate of increase. So significant cost growth relative to the cost of employing people in the rest of the organisation. So if we kind of look now into what people were saying about what happened as a result of COVID-19, or certainly what is happening now after the pandemic, it really did accelerate those long-term trends that people had seen. And a key one that was universal for everybody was this reduction in response rate. It really had been accelerated by the pandemic. There are a number of factors that people kind of pointed to around this. Social behaviours and social aversion as a lasting impact of the pandemic, general levels of trust with government, the continued attention on personal data privacy and GDPR, and awareness of kind of data exploitation, how it's used. challenges of hybrid working and more varied working patterns, and a decline in skilled interviewers. Thinking about the impacts of the tasks of the face-to-face interviewer, it really did fall very much dependent on the nature of the research. So the respondents told us that where a rich qualitative experience was essential and commissioners did not see or accept an alternative to online, where much of it obviously moved during the pandemic, the proportions of face-to-face interview work remained relatively constant, and they reported that now after COVID, that's very much rebounded to the same level. And as a consequence, the nature of the role remained quite unchanged. Most of their issues focused on continued workforce supply challenges, which we'll come to in a moment, and these lower response rates. Elsewhere, that ongoing decline in face-to-face interviewing was accelerated, and other survey methods, particularly online, of course, have become much more acceptable. The perception was the higher cost of face-to-face wasn't prepared to be borne. One quote was that people reported that the pandemic let the genie out of the bottle. So the response that was reporting is there had been an uptake in mixed mode methods, along with client expectations are also shifting. The demands were that the surveys would need to remain cheaper, quicker, of the same quality, and with more frequent progress reporting. Organisations also talked about giving more flexibility to the subject in terms of the method they wanted to use to complete the response, with the field interviewer more used for knock to nudge, but also completing the field interviews themselves, where they remain the holder of the case rather than being put into a separate unit. So instances of multi-skilling kind of coming through. So the real consequence of this increase of these mixed mode methods have been really a shift in the focus of the field interviewer. Typically, the majority of respondents, people report to, are captured by the web, then by the telephone, and with field interviewers then tending to be more focused on hard-to-reach respondents and seeking out interviewees. Field managers said that the perception, to quote, is that all the easy interviews are gone before you get to the field worker. They kind of challenged that perception, but it was certainly one that was there. So the view was that this combination of this reduced response rate and a narrower focus on hard-to-reach respondents was resulting in a fundamental shift in the primary emphasis of the role, from interviewing to finding and engaging individuals to undertake a research survey. That's not one replacing the other, but rather the emphasis was more on one than the other. And they saw that as a real impact on field interviewers. They typically valued that interview interaction. There was satisfaction on completion, and they really saw interviewing as a skill in which they took pride. This shift in focus towards seeking and engaging potentially reticent subjects was perceived as being much more demanding, required more resilience, and overall was less attractive to traditional and potential field interviewers. I mentioned about workforce challenges, regardless of the nature of whether it was kind of more marketing-led or more social research-led. These were kind of pretty common. COVID had a real impact on workers, and with a sharp rise in retirement and a fall in those experienced interviewers. So although that older workforce profile exists, and it's still populated by the retirement cohort, and they want this as a second job for more highly flexible and supplemental work, that was still seen as being evident. There was a real loss of skill and experience of people who it forced them to rethink their priorities, or there was concerns about healthcare exposure for this older work group. They just didn't return. Particularly, we're thinking here, obviously, the UK market, but I know it's common in other geographies. These reports of labour shortage were very common across the board, and some participants' organisations reported losing work because they couldn't get enough interviews to be able to complete it. There was also a perception there's much fewer people coming into the labour pool of potential interviewers. So there seemed to be a smaller pool of people with those skills for interviewing post-pandemic, and increasingly all the research agencies tended to work from the same pool of workers. And with that, they saw that worker exclusivity had significantly declined. One of them said that there's less stickiness with our interviewers. We can't really rely on their loyalty. They also reported that workers tend to be a bit more selective about what they choose to do, and their preferences what was called the more simple hall tests, exit interviews, indoor work, and certainly with a less reduced desire to travel. So that had a bit more of an impact on those undertaking more social research studies. Trying to get younger workers in was also more challenging. They wanted more guarantees and certainties around work, and it was a barrier overall to hiring labour. Some organisations really felt like that some of the labour force issues were a real driver to pushing and keeping work online and using other methods rather than face-to-face. So all saw that this was a really competitive labour market, but the traditional attractiveness that was offered by the role had really been declined. There were many other organisations offering similar opportunities, and with employment rights in the UK for flexible workers having become much more valued and consistent, there was much more competition amongst other providers of such flexible labour for those who want casual employment with reasonable guarantees. There's a lot of recruitment going on in the industry currently, as you would expect. The industry has converged on some of the major recruitment hubs like Indeed. They're tending to be fishing in the same kind of pools, and they're finding quite significant challenges. They observe that the industry rather, does need to look more broadly. They've tried to look at student labour. That had mixed success. There had certainly been value in supervisor or interviewer-led hiring, so referrals, for example, but that's very difficult to operate at scale. Lastly, churns did tend to remain quite high, but much of that was a lot related to role compatibility and the quality of applicants. So if we just kind of look at those, the field interviewer role changes, if you're able to look at the report, we've detailed in a full job profile, job description or role profile, if you will, for both the role before and the role post-pandemic. But what was interesting to observe is that the nature of the role is diverging depending on the nature of the work. So for those who what we describe as more marketing-led, where there's a rich qualitative experience required, they report there'd been little change in the face-to-face interview role. It was very much the same as it had been prior to the pandemic. Those much more involved in the social policy research, they'd seen quite a significant role change. It's driven by this shift to a more mixed mode approach to data collection and the decline in the response rate. One organisation had used had used post-pandemic as an opportunity to completely redesign their fieldwork approach and rethink it, such were they kind of driven by the changes. And that's detailed in the report. So I'm not going to kind of go through in massive detail and talk about this. You can be able to see in the report. But the key changes in the competencies, the skills, knowledge and behaviours required to be able to fulfil the role are as follows. So from an accountability point of view, there is much greater requirement in the role now for being multi-skilled, for individuals to be able to complete surveys in person, to be able to undertake that over video and also by telephone. The primary focus not being on interviewing, but the primary focus on engagement. So it's engagement and interviewing in that order. Consequently, it was reported they felt like there was a greater appreciation of different survey designs and methods were required for the role to be able to operate effectively as they sought to engage, persuade individuals to be able to undertake the survey. And the role requires more skill with varied IT platforms and systems. So not just technology, but also video technology, telephone technology, so on and so forth. From a behaviour point of view, this was a significant shift, driven by the requirement for persuasion, building trust, overcoming objections in order to get people to be engaged and undertake the survey. High levels of resilience came with that, with the harder to reach focus and ability to be able to bounce back and respond positively in the face of rejection. And the final point raised by the respondents was generally the face-to-face interviewer needed to be able to engage with change positively, as that was a much more frequent part of their work. So in talking with the participants through the research and in the group discussion we held afterwards, they observed some potential implications of some of these changes in the role. So for those with performance reward models, that piecework model we talked about, many highlighted concerns with the ongoing feasibility of the model. The decline in response rates at interviews meant there was a growing level of risk for the reward, with greater income uncertainty and unpredictability. In effect, you'd be spending longer trying to get that one reward, and therefore the value of it increased relatively. So that's the balance between risk and reward there. So that they felt like this would be unattractive to workers, many of whom are seeking greater certainty, and therefore this growing pressure for organisations to pay for time. Although some organisations did talk about paying for different types of interaction, not just the successful completion of a survey, it was perceived as being kind of quite complex. Respondents also talked about a potential risk not only on the field interviewer, but also if there's a higher value placed on the completed interview, is there a potential risk of less than ethical behaviour? Is there a risk to the organisation with that model? However, what is certainly true is people were quite nervous about any kind of moves away from this type of approach. It was felt like it was really a key part of how work was done and how costs were managed, and that was an overwhelming feature. So this change in the primary role of the survey fieldworker was felt by participants to be something that the interviewers were struggling with, particularly those who viewed the interview interaction with members of the public and the satisfaction that comes from achieving those interviews and taking pride in their interviewing skills. So with that shift in engaging with reticent members of the public, it was seen that respondents required workers to undertake activities that are just harder, with greater potential for more conflict and rejection, and just making the work much less rewarding and more challenging. So for the traditional cohort of retired or pre-retirement folks, their motivation, it was perceived as being as much about community engagement, spending time with people, as it is about supplementary pay, and that really could have a disproportionate impact. One of the other challenges as well is that with a smaller labour pool, individuals were being seen to choose less complex work, which made the more complex survey, particularly social research survey work, and more challenging, harder to reach engagement as being less attractive and desirable. However, we'd also observe as well that one of the consequences is, as work becomes more kind of challenging, more multi-skilled, is there an emerging most complex level of field interviewer that could manage both multi-mode and complex field interactions? That could enable a different sort of organisational response in terms of employment or pay. This point about stickiness and detachment came through. Traditionally, the field interviewer had always been kept somewhat detached from the organisation, and it was inevitable given the need to avoid confusion with employed status. It was now becoming a bit of an issue because it further eroded any loyalty between the individual organisation and the person in a tight labour market, particularly keeping experienced interviewers. And as the role became more challenging and greater need for resilience, more support was required, which is difficult to do when those people are generally a bit more detached. The final point that was made on the slide here is that there was a question. As you know, we were mostly talking to kind of field managers, senior kind of directors of field operations, and they did ask the question: is there sufficient appreciation of the workforce challenges by methodologists? The owners of those resources really felt it was difficult to push back with these operational considerations. One of them said a lot of design issues tend to be quite fixed by the time it gets to us, and they felt like that more consideration could be given in how surveys designed and the need around and the use of face-to-face interviewers could be better thought through with a better appreciation of some of the labour force and operational and cost challenges that they were facing on the ground. So that kind of summarises what we're really hearing, but it was interesting to ask as well some of the responses and also kind of get your thoughts in terms of next steps. So, as you'll appreciate, many of the responses to what we're hearing out there are going to come from individual organisations themselves, and rather than collectively. So, these some thoughts here are things that things that I have thought about in discussion with groups, and things that they are actively doing and pursuing themselves. So that's a mix. So, the role potentially will continue to evolve with the multi-skilling, asking interviewers to do more. That's typical. The dual workforce model is something that's worthwhile. Organisations are starting to think about, and a number of them are trialing this currently. So where the work profile allows, organisations can potentially start to see two tiers of role, where you have more complex work and multi-skilling being performed by more permanent workers, with the division then to more simple and straightforward work be the preserve of the traditional, more casual labour. So this kind of reflects what we typically see in the wider economy, where who carries the employment risk really depends on those barriers to entry for labour. And as the roles get more complex, there's more value in organisations retaining that labour and doing that in a kind of a permanent way. So, as I said, some organisations have reported trialling with a small permanent workforce operating in parallel. High levels of pay was kind of talked about frequently. It's not only about continued competition for effective face-to-face interviews within that dwindling labour pool, but also about reflecting the increased complexity of the role, and challenging as well the decreased attractiveness of the work, whether that's reticence to undertake more multi-skilled work or the greater challenges with this increased emphasis on harder to engage groups. Clearly, changes in pay model are things that some people are thinking about, but I would emphasize there's a high degree of attachment to the current model where that exists, and then a high degree of concerns about costs. I think it's kind of interesting to reflect that regardless of the kind of cost model being taken, the minimum wage is always going to be the driver in the UK. It's really more about the kind of employment model and how that is really going to be used, which is probably a stronger issue. But there was a high degree of concern amongst participants that the face-to-face interview approach tends to be much more costly relative to other methods. The role of the supervisor was something which I reflected on thinking about my wider experience. It really more as a potential way to support the retention of face-to-face field workers. Would be this greater emphasis on the focus on supervisory and management skills. In talking to the participant organisations, they typically saw the role of the supervisor being primarily one about schedule organisation, field interview management and deployment, and sometimes, as we heard, being accountable for the recruitment of individuals into their own local panel. From a recruitment perspective, there have been many positive examples of supervisors being very effective in attracting people into the role of face-to-face interviewer, and that's going to continue to be important. But what we certainly didn't hear is there not being much talked about in terms of the role of supervisor as being one of a coach, a support, and a manager of effective employee performance. It's not really surprising given the history of the role and the kind of casual nature of the work and the fact that it's been kind of somewhat detached. But as the role of the face-to-face interviewer becomes more demanding, organisations could be well-minded to consider giving more attention to that aspect of the role. Face-to-face interviewers could find it very valuable to be supported to build more resilience, and being provided with good coaching, building mental strength, endurance, resilience, could be very effective in supporting and increasing their lengths of tenure. Moreover, if the organisations are tending to move towards a more employed models, or indeed moving away from pay for performance models, then supervisors also play a crucial role in improving individual employee performance, or indeed appropriately, effectively and ethically managing individual performance out of the business. Lastly, as you'd expect, organisations continue to think about divergent labour pools, although that does appear to be quite a struggle at the moment. Students were talked about, as I mentioned before, but with very much mixed success. So we did ask the question about, is there indeed a role for a more collective sector-wide response? And one thing that certainly came through is raising the profile of the field interviewer with the public through marketing, social media, or other methods. As this was we were talking around the time of the ITV drama on the post office scandal related to sub-postmasters. It was talked about, can a character appear in a drama to provide greater public understanding of surveys, the role they play, and the role of the survey interviewer, to think about how survey responses can be challenged or promote the role of the field interviewer to help improve the supply into the labour pool. One more thing which is worthwhile thinking about is an idea which could be further explored is around this labour pool issue, is to focus on reducing the costs and inefficiencies in the labour pool for organisations, as currently the different individual organisations are competing with each other for this relatively small amount of labour. There could be some value in centralising efforts to promote the role. It's effectively what economists would call about affecting labour market friction. So this idea here is like borrowing from ideas of digital networks or digital marketplaces. So rather than individual organisations retaining their own interviewer labour, a third party could be contracted to be a source of face-to-face interviewer labour. They wouldn't necessarily directly employ them, but it would manage entry into this labour pool, which would be digital through a form of accreditation or effective kind of training in some form. Could be interesting to explore the extent to which digital tools could be used, such that organisations requiring interviewers with particular skills and knowledge to cover work of particular types, locations, durations, could search a database of accredited knowledge to cover these different works and push work out to them, and reducing the need for hiring. As it's a database, worker schedules could even be hosted. It could be a more dynamic way to be able to link up those with the skills and those who need the labour. The idea is that, for workers, projects could be pushed to them, reducing the need to chase work, improving their ability to obtain consistent work from multiple employers, improving their skills, giving them the more certainty and guarantee of work many of them seek. It's really about formalising what's already happening, but in a way that could kind of reduce some of the frictions and divert monies away from competition to labour to creating a service. So the owners of such a service could have a vested interest in promoting the roles and increasing the pool of labour. And this point about accreditation would be important, so that workers had a stake in the network, and organisations know that when they're hiring appropriate workers, they're ready to go and reduce their demands on assessment and training. So outside of the organisations, workers could also have a virtual hub with this that could potentially be a source of knowledge and community. So it's an idea and a thought. I think it's could be worthwhile if you agreed engaging with the recruitment consultancies or similar, who typically might be well placed to comment on this, to explore the idea further if it was deemed feasible or desirable. I guess one of the questions really is, who would be the person who could manage that response, who would own the collective response and action and take that forward? That was one of my first questions as I thought about it. So just to conclude then, we have already kind of started plans to undertake further research to hear the voice of the interviewer. Sierra is already kind of making plans around that, as well as engaging with other organisations to see what exit interview data they might have that we might be able to mine and understand. Obviously, engagement with the key stakeholders and commissioners is anticipated on next steps, but we're keen to hear from this community what other steps could be taken to be able to take this further in terms of addressing some of the challenges that seem to be very universal across the sector. Okay, Debbie, I think that's back to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thank you, Sierra, for a really interesting presentation and discussion of the findings so far. We've a number of questions that people have posed in the Q&A. Please feel free to add your questions or thoughts on what you've heard to the Q&A. I'm just going to run through a couple of these. We have a couple of field interviewers, either present or past field interviewers on the call, which is on the seminar, which is great. So and there are a couple of things from them. So Robert is a recently retired interviewer with 14 years experience, and he thinks, Chris, that you've totally nailed the overarching issues and the interviewer's perspective. Thanks very much, Robert. As you heard, we are planning to do some further work with field interviewers themselves, because the people that we spoke with were the kind of people who have overall responsibility for field face-to-face survey interviewing in the range of organisations that Sierra mentioned earlier. So we are hoping to speak to them as well, but it's reassuring that you also recognised these challenges. Tawhid, apologies if I've mispronounced your name. I'm a new freelance worker. I wonder if the technological and ergonomic aspects of the role, i.e. carrying heavy laptops and show cards, are considered as a negative element impacting on retaining staff. Chris, did any issues of that nature come up?
That didn't really come up, but it's always interesting to reflect on those kind of more pragmatic things, because working outside was seen to be a real barrier. I'm not sure you can ever necessarily kind of get around that, but that was certainly seen as a barrier to people taking much more simple indoor hall test type work rather than more complex social work. And funny enough, one of the things that the directors talked about was practical things to support, which is parking. Is it possible to be able to enable individuals to be able to have dispensation so they can kind of park more effectively? So we mustn't forget those practical things. But no, I didn't hear much about those actual kind of physical tools.
That's obviously something that we can potentially incorporate into the issues that we'll explore with interviewers. So that's a really helpful pointer for us, Tawhid. So thank you for that.
And Tahib, just on that point with the additional interviews, I'll be proposing, from my experience, we use a total reward model. So it looks at kind of pay and benefits, careers and development, work environment, and culture. So it really tries to cover all of those things that people are engaged with, both intellectually and physically around their work. So try and take that holistic view.
Great, thank you. And a question from Nora. Were any concerns over interviewer safety raised? We are aware this was an issue during COVID-19, but are interested in how the responsibility of the survey company and also commissioners may have changed in relation to personal safety of interviewers. Would this become more important with focus on harder to reach groups?
That's a really good point. I think that is not something that came up at all. I think that's definitely something for us to add in with our as a specific question when we come to our next stage. Don't you think, Debbie?
Yes, I do. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Nora.
So Sarah Henry says, thank you, very interesting. How attractive are the roles for new entrants? Are different people showing interest in becoming interviewers?
We don't have that data from the discussions we've had so far. I was struck that taking a kind of outside-in perspective, people were looking in the same old places. I would challenge that there is scope for greater creativity in some of the recruitment activity that the organisation seems to be taking, but it is an individual organisational decision. People seem to be following the same thing. Students, Indeed, online platforms. So there wasn't. I think there's more that could be done there.
Because the model has traditionally been that it tended that survey interviewers tend to be older, tend to be more female workforce than male workforce. And did you have any sense that anything had changed very much in terms of that demographic profile of workers?
No, I didn't at all. But I don't have the data on this, but there's a gut feeling I've got that you have a period of time where people have had relatively good early retirement benefits. So in the wider economy, those benefits are always associated with defined benefit or final salary schemes. Those have really died out. So increasingly over time, those people who are able to take early retirement and might have been part of that kind of cohort that you would rely on as an industry is reducing. So on the one hand, no, I didn't hear anything about anything other than that same kind of cohort being similar, despite steps to try to make it more diverse. I'm also reflecting that I think that is going to be becoming more and more rare going forward.
Thanks, Chris. Mike Daly asks, I imagine that currently survey organisations are competing for interviewers, which could tend to drive wages up. Would centralisation risk changing this with a negative impact on the workforce?
Well, I suppose it depends where your perspective is. From the worker's point of view, indeed from the employer's point of view, not so much. There are issues. This is one of the things probably to challenge around this kind of approach, where you end up you don't really want any kind of collusion around labour and wage setting. But I think what there is a reflection is that the increased complexity of the work is really seen as being a driver of wage rates. But what is clear from the data is that it's the rise in the minimum wage rate. So government policy, which is the major increase in average wage rates for this role, which tends to be in that minimum wage or slightly above minimum wage type of area.
Thank you. And Gillian asks, I think the role of the coordinator is the crucial key to success. Knowing how they view the role would be very interesting. They are the link. So, Gillian, when you say coordinator here, are you thinking of what we would call the supervisor role in this? I don't know if, Stefan, we can unmute Gillian.
Debbie, which Gillian is it?
Gillian Wall.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, hi, Gillian.
I'm actually attending from the Central Statistics Office in Ireland.
Welcome.
And it's been really interesting because it's actually quite relevant to our work as well. I'm a questionnaire designer, and it is something that we always take into account, by the way, is the working conditions of the interviewer. But just thinking of the supervisor, I suppose I mean the coordinator, the person who's supervising the interviewers going out. And sometimes I wonder, do they see their role as just more paperwork?
Yeah. Yes.
Tick boxes, rather than it being sort of like a collective responsibility, or how they can support the interviewer but yet report back to their client.
Yes, Gillian, that's exactly what
crucial role. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was hearing, is that it was seen as a technical job. It was, as you say, kind of a paper admin tick box type thing. It's obviously more than that, but there was a desire to kind of keep a bit of distance, actually, because they're casual workers. We can't have them seen to be employed. We don't have any issues with IR35 or other kind of government regulations. We don't want to be seen to be doing anything wrong. So there's those kind of concerns. So quite well-meaning, but it made it kind of quite transactional. It's about distribution of work. I definitely think, and I didn't hear anything about it becoming a bit much more close, but I certainly know from all the research evidence around how you engage people effectively in their employment performance that actually the managerial relationship or the supervisory relationship is super critical. And that seems to be something which organizations will need to get better at if they're going to have more permanent workers, or if the work is going to be more difficult, if they want to retain and if they want to kind of do something a bit different. So that means a skill change in the supervisors, the supervisors or coordinators, as you say, as much as thinking about the change in the role in the face-to-face interviewer.
Yeah, I suppose we have a slightly different perspective in that all our interviewers are actually employees.
Right, so you're probably already there.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but
yes, well, aspirationally.
yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Gillian. John Roth-Smith asks, it was mentioned about knock to nudge being less rewarding than getting an interview response? Is there feedback for the interviewer when someone subsequently completes the survey? I'm not sure if you know the answer to that, Chris.
I don't think I do know the answer. And I suppose it also depends on the workforce design, because in some cases that nudge to nudge would have been either nudge to web, because we talked about that flexibility, in which case in most cases they wouldn't know, or nudge to telephone. Now in some cases, if they had a model where they owned that casework, it could be them who are doing the telephone. Okay, well, how would you like to do it? Do you want to talk now, or do you want to talk on the telephone later? And that'll be me. So that was done sometimes, so in which case they would, but I think in most cases they probably wouldn't. I suspect, but I don't really know. I'm guessing at that one.
Thanks, Chris. So a question from Lisa: is there any consideration being given to splitting interviewer tasks? So some interviewers who are doing the engagement task, similar to door-to-door salesperson, and then to set up appointments for a different interviewer to actually do the interview.
Yes, well, that's more of the kind of traditional model in terms of creating the appointment schedule, and then individuals will go out to do it. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I mean, I think that it will vary, but certainly in social research, it's tended to be that the interviewers would be the people who would be visiting addresses and setting up appointments, and then they come back and do it. So I don't think, in answer to Lisa's question, that we came across any of.
Yeah, I'm just thinking now. I certainly heard both. A central panel scheduling it, and then first contact would be post kind of letter receipt from, or it would be for perhaps the more smaller social research, there'd just be allocation of the work within a particular patch, and therefore they do first contact themselves. But I suspect with the trend towards multi-skilling, it's going to be more of the same. But also do look in the report about how the organisation which is doing the complete redesign is thinking about it. There's a bit more detail there on their approach.
Thanks, Chris. So Anne asks, if you haven't planned yet, could you think about asking about how things such as physical comfort, heat, humidity, time of day, difficulty accessing a toilet, etc., might lead to more skipped questions or missing data? So Anne, what were you thinking in relation to this? So this is Anne Moore, Stefan. Do you want to elaborate?
Should be able to speak now, Anne.
A little bit more on your question, Anne.
Sorry, yes, I couldn't figure out how to unmute. So I was thinking about how the physical challenges of doing field work are perhaps what you said you'd be looking at next. And when we send field workers into remote locations where they are having to deal with the physical demands of walking distance, great distances between homes or health facilities, they're in locations where they can't access a toilet, they're very physically uncomfortable, they might be hungry, whether interviewers are saying that they wind up not being able to field the questionnaire as well, and maybe deliberately choosing ways of taking the path through the questionnaire that omits the long additional sections.
We didn't speak with interviewers directly, so that's the first point to make clear. Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, well, just to say, I think, Anne, this is a point for next steps, isn't it?
That's what I understood, and so I was just putting in a plug for.
Thank you.
Hopefully, you including that in your next steps, because I'm desperate to get data on something that we could refer to look at this.
Okay, we hear you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne. So there was a question from Filippo. In-home interviewing versus doorstep interviewing. Has anything come up in terms of trends pre-post-COVID, especially regarding public perceptions?
I think that's probably covered by what we're talking about in terms of response rate. That, you know, the pandemic obviously impacted this stuff around social behavior and social aversion. I don't really want to have contact with you to be able to talk about and things like that. And obviously hybrid working, are people there, they're working from home, can't take it now, things like this. And obviously there was the health issue about not wanting to have people inside, but okay to do it kind of outside. So obviously were those things. But also there's don't forget there's also the kind of longer term trends that people pointed to, which is about privacy, GDPR, and issues like that, which are also factors. I think given that the cohort of most of the interviewers was a bit older, so 50 plus, 60 plus, then the organizations responded that for many of them, the health impacts or health risks associated with being inside and a greater understanding of disease and disease vectors and things like this was a factor for many of them choosing to call time on their careers.
Thanks, Chris. So a question from Delphine. So we face the same challenges here in Quebec, Canada. Thank you for joining us very early in the morning for you. We appreciate that, especially regarding recruitment and retention of experienced interviewers. Do you have any ideas or recommendations on different pay models? What model seems to be most interesting to the interviewers?
Well, we don't know yet about how the interviewers feel about it. That's certainly the case. But I just kind of refer you to some of the things that I was alluding to when we're talking about the kind of research. As the classic model is going to be that as the demands of the organization on the role increase and it becomes more complex, there is definitely that case for retaining those skills, which could lead to a more kind of permanent employment model. I think within that, you can still have performance models within it, but I think there might be some degree of caution around how far you want to kind of push the performance pay model to ensure that there's kind of credibility in outcomes. I think the casual worker model is still kind of very, very valuable from a kind of a cost perspective, but it depends on the nature of the work that's being for your individual organization. If there's sufficient supply of work and it's predictable and regular, then having a more permanent approach is probably no bad thing. You can engage more, improve the quality, reduce costs related to turnover by emphasizing more on supervisor quality and things like this. So there organizations will have their own principles about what to take, but I think the employment model is probably even more impactful than the pay model, I think. And that, I think the heart of thinking that out is how complex do you want to make the work. I just think you'll see more and more this growth of the dual employment model. So both having a smaller core of employed workers on a more regular employed basis with or without some performance model within it, taking the bulk of the work being deployed flexibly in a multi-skilled way, making those roles more interesting and more valuable, and then a lower, less skilled, more casual workforce. I can imagine that evolving. That seems to be where we are over here in the UK.
So there's a related question from Teresa. How are research companies meeting the challenge of rethinking their enumeration models for face-to-face interviewers?
Sorry, just say that again. How are they?
How are research companies meeting the challenge of rethinking their remuneration models for face-to-face interviewers?
It strikes me that it's very early days. I was struck that it seemed to be a group of individuals in flux. So if we think about it, there's two groups here. There's a group here who are consistently doing, say, the face-to-face interview role hasn't changed very much. It's exit interviews, hall tests, more marketing led. The role is the same. They're keeping those tending to be more employed, and it's more straightforward. Well, casual worker, but kind of more shift-based kind of pay, not pay for performance. The group much more in the social side, which is probably more interest to this group, are this group very much in flux. They have very much relied on a casual worker and piecework model of just paying for each completed survey. And there is a recognition that this is under challenge and they're not sure how to go forward. And at the moment, they are trialing different models. The issue around cost is the one which is really driving them to be kind of very concerned about it. Personally, I think the cost is driven through the employment model, not through the pay model. So I think you can still have a kind of a pay performance type style approach, or a more pay for time approach within both models if desired. But yeah, it's really challenging for them. I don't think there's a clear pattern, and they are piloting different approaches currently in some organisations.
Thank you. There are a number of additional kind of questions relating to things that we could potentially look at
Wonderful.
in the next stage of our research. So thank you to those people who've posted further ideas, questions that we could address potentially when we're looking at interviewers. You'll see if Chris, if you could move the slides through to the end, there are contact details there, how you can reach out to us. It doesn't have our email addresses on there, but if you want to reach out to us, you can do so. You can find us via NatSen. Sierra and our details are on the NatSen website. Chris's website details are there. His email address is there. So please do feel free to get in touch with us. If you have any thoughts or questions, or you want to speak with us further about this research, it's ongoing, and we've been more than happy to engage with people about that. Hopefully time for one last question from Eileen in Germany, who says, from my perspective, relying less on face-to-face interviewer administered modes, more on self-administered modes like online or mail has several advantages in addition to cost: less errors, representation, better coverage. Some of these are debatable. I would argue reduced measurement errors, social desirability bias. How is this move to more to other modes likely to affect the future of interviewers? Is there going to be less need for interviewers overall? I feel like that's a question that I could answer, in a way, because this is in part one of the motivations for this piece of research. And there is an active debate about what's the role of face-to-face interviewers. From my point of view, they play still an incredibly important role, particularly where we talk about doing research which is inclusive and hearing from all members of society. Even though, relatively speaking, in countries like Germany and the UK, we have quite high internet penetration rates, there is still a significant group of people who do not have access or are not confident or willing to go online to take part in surveys. There are certain kinds of measurements, certain kinds of data that are incredibly difficult to collect purely online. I think that there is a challenge for us as a sector to think about how we justify the costs of doing face-to-face survey work or involving interviewers, what added value that does. In my view, I don't know that we've done a good enough job yet of making that case. And if you look in our report, you will see that in the market research sector, in some parts of that, they seem to have done a better job. And there may be some things that we can learn from them in that regard. So I'm conscious of time. It's 1 o'clock here in the UK. Thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you, Chris and Sierra, for your very interesting presentation. As I say, in the chat, you'll have a link to our report. Please do get in touch with us if you want to know more, and we will be reaching out to key stakeholders and doing some further work which we'll come back and share with you in due course. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.